Welcome. This is the Green Mountain Book Festival, and we are going to be talking about world building in science fiction for the next hour, plus or minus a little bit maybe. The panelists are going to have a discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions, at some point in a little while. I just want to introduce our panelists for you. William Alexander, right here, is the author. You know what? I actually wear glasses, and I think I'll put them on. Perfect. Excellent. Okay. William Alexander is the author of Goblin Secrets and Other Unrealisms for Young Readers. His work has won the National Book Award, the Eleanor Cameron Award, the Librarian Favorites Award, the Teacher Favorites Award, and 2 CBC Best Children's Book of the Year awards. Sunward, his first novel for grown-ups, will be published by Saga Press in September of 2025. Well, will be. Has done. Yeah. I should have said it differently too. As a small child, he honestly believed that his Cuban-American family came from the lost island of Atlantis. I love that. Margot Harrison, in the middle, is the author of The Midnight Club, The Library of Fates, and 4 young adult thrillers, including an Indies Introduce pick, 2 Junior Library Guild selections, and 2 Vermont Book Award finalists. Her award-winning book and film reviews have appeared in 7 Days and the New York Times. She grew up in New York and now lives here with us in Vermont. Brian Staveley is the author of the award-winning fantasy trilogy, The Chronicle of the Unhewn Throne, which has been translated into a dozen languages worldwide. Skullshorn, a standalone novel set in the same world, and most recently, The Empire's Ruin, the beginning of a new epic trilogy. After teaching literature, philosophy, history, and religion for more than a decade, Brian began writing fiction. He now lives on a steep dirt road in the mountains of southern Vermont, where he divides his time between fathering, writing, mountain biking, splitting wood, skiing, and adventuring, not necessarily in that order. So welcome all of you, and welcome all of you. I thought I would just get things started by asking a question about world building and see if you start a discussion, and if you need more questions later, I've got some for you. So I think we could start with, what are the elements that you consider essential in building a world?
You want us to use this mic?
Yes, please. And oh, I'm sorry. And please pass the mic. You can take it off the stand and pass it along. Or can you? Perfect. And you get to start because you're holding it.
I think that there is no one specific element, because it depends what kind of book you're trying to write and what you're trying to do with your characters. So in some contexts, the history of the world or the land that you're dealing with might be crucially important to the project you're undertaking, and in some contexts that might be boring as hell. In fact, in most contexts it might be boring as hell, but I tend to do a lot of it because for my books it kind of matters. In another circumstance, maybe the mechanics of space flight are super important, or the social dynamics and political dynamics of a city at a certain time. So my answer would be, you need to figure out what kind of story you're telling before you figure out what kind of world building is going to be super important to that story.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have not written any secondary world fantasies or future science fiction. What I write is sort of like contemporary novels with speculative elements. So the world building is basically grafted on top of our own world, and the history is the history of our own world with a few changes. So it's sort of a delicate process of fitting 2 things together and trying to make the fantastical elements seem natural and at home in our own world, as opposed to creating from scratch, which I have done a little bit of, not for publication yet, but that's fun, but it's different, very extensive.
It's different. I write secondary world fantasy and distant science fiction. So yes, and I find that the most essential element is, I think, questions more than anything else. Because especially when doing secondary world stuff, especially when building an entire world, there's a certain kind of imposter complex that afflicts writers, where we're in the shadow of Tolkien and the legend that you spend 20 years building a world before you start the novel. He didn't really do that. Also, he changed where entire mountain ranges were when they became inconvenient. So, the sort of like build a world and then it's a coherent world and only then are you allowed to tell any stories in it. That is nonsense, and Tolkien didn't do it either. But that's sort of the looming expectation, right? We have to fully understand this alien place before we have permission to even think that we know what goes on there. How many realists understand how this world works? None of them. None of them. So that sort of granting yourself permission to tell a story in a world that you don't fully understand. It's okay. You understand it better than anybody else because you made it up. And a sense of exploration, a sense of curiosity. And I can't point to any one essay, but throughout Essays About Craft by Ursula Le Guin, she talked a lot about questions. And just asking, like, what's over there? And looking at the map that she drew of the Earthsea archipelago, like, I wonder what they do on that island. Well, I'm pretty sure they do this, and they make rush-wash tea, and they do that, and this sort of thing. And she's like, I didn't know any of that, 10 minutes ago, but just by asking the question. And so if you're exploring a place rather than expecting to already somehow know everything about it, in which case you're just conning yourself and everyone else. That's a lot more valuable and takes a lot of the stress of your own imagined expertise.
Brian, I have a question for you. Do you create like detailed Bibles, continuity Bibles for your world?
Yeah, unfortunately. I like the idea of exploration, and I think that's exactly true. And I find that I run into problems when I start, especially if my characters have arrived in a new place, a new city, and I haven't done the work behind it. I inevitably run almost immediately into problems because they're going to go somewhere, and I'm like, I don't know what the hell they're looking at. I don't know what's in the background. I don't know what they're eating or drinking. I don't know what the sounds are. And the writing grinds to a halt. Almost, sometimes I'll bumble on and I'll write 3 shitty chapters. And then after a week, I'm like, oh, those were 3 shitty chapters. I guess I need to erase those. And then I need to go back and do exactly what you said and think like, okay, what's the deal with this city? How long has it been here? Where'd it come from? What's the commerce based on? What are the politics of the city? Almost none of that goes into the book because it would be extremely tedious. But I need to do it for me, or I don't know how to write the scenes. Margot, you've said that you work primarily in our world, but I imagine you have to spend some time thinking about what aspects of our world you want to draw out. Like, what's that process like for you?
Yeah, it kind of depends how much I create from whole cloth and how much I go on what I know about the world. And it can be very subjective. For instance, for my new book, which is coming out in December, The Library of Fates, it's purple. I set it at Harvard University, and I created a library at Harvard University that doesn't exist, but it's in a real building that I'm familiar with. And when I wrote about Widener Library, which is right next door, I'm very familiar with that too. I used to work there, so I felt like I had to get the details entirely right. Like, how do you go down to the subterranean stacks? And I ended up researching that on Reddit and getting somebody's video of how you do it because I really wanted to know. I didn't want to get it wrong. But then I had another section of the book that is set in Paris, in the palace, the Luxembourg Palace. And I've also been there, but somehow for Paris, I was kind of okay with just making it up. The book's probably not going to be translated into French, so it'll be okay. Like, I mean, I used a real building, but I created a cellar with like a dark hole in it, where they find like some secret special thing, et cetera, et cetera. And that was kind of freeing, I have to say. So I have to say, I have read Sunward, and it's a great book. And what really impressed me about it is there's so much in this world. Like, there's so much world building behind it, but the book is only 224 pages long. So I want to know, William, how did you do that?
We have 2 mics now, I think. Hello, yes. Okay, when I was 15 years old, I thought, I'm going to grow up to be a writer, and I'm going to write like door-stopping monstrosity fantasy novels.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
Can't recommend it.
I haven't so far. Like, I set out to write a novel, and it's done, and it's this big. And I thought, well, I write for kids. That's okay. And then I wrote for grown-ups, and it's shorter. And I don't know why. It seems to be the rhythm of my brain. What's a more interesting answer than that? I really enjoyed. I think a lot of the brevity came from the protagonist, because this is also my first novel written in first person, and she's very. I can talk. She's very terse. She's like, and really insightful. I mean, I would write a lot and think, okay, no, this is the thing that she'd say. And it's just, I would have to babble to find the precise thing that she'd say, and then I'd cut all the rest out. And so I think it was shaped in terms of length and scope. She just knew the right thing to say. Like, yeah, this is the only thing you need to know about this entire moon. Just that. And it was so much character shaped.
Can I ask you another question about that? And maybe for both of you, I think we've all written in first person, and world building in first person, I think, is a pretty different endeavor from world building in third person. How much did you think about the person or the venue in which your book is spoken, right? Like the first person is talking to someone, presumably. How much did you think about that? And to what degree does that affect the world building, right? If they're talking to someone who knows the world really well, they're going to omit a ton of information. If they're talking to somebody who's completely new to the story or the world, they include a lot of information. How did that play out for both of you in working in first person specifically?
My 2 adult books are actually in third person. But I have written 4 books in first person. Those are thrillers, though, so they didn't really involve any world building. But I am currently writing something in first person that involves world building, and yeah, it's kind of difficult. I mean, I do have one point of view character who doesn't know a whole lot about certain things in the world, so they get a lot of exposition from other characters. But it's tricky because you don't want to fall into that, as you don't want it to be too exposition heavy. And for some reason, my last editor thought that exposition and dialogue, that readers don't absorb that. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that was her opinion. So she wanted the dialogue cut as much as possible. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Lies. Lies. I hope. I mean, okay, did I think of a specific time and place where she's essentially telling the novel? No. But as a character note, I did think she was talking to someone of that universe. Mm-hmm. And so omitting or finding a way to indirectly refer to the things that everybody knows. Yeah. But sort of where I got around that is that she's babysitting baby robots all the time, and which kind of came directly from what pandemic parenting was like. And so this sort of weird, cozy, horrifying, but fine in the immediate context, constantly sort of teaching. And so she's always explaining. And which just that relationship to the other characters in that situation gave me such a huge blank check for expository dialogue. Because she's surrounded by really smart beings who have very little experience of the solar system, and she gets to just tell them how it is all the time. And maybe that's tired. So the book is like 90% expository dialogue. So yeah, maybe that's wrong.
No, I mean, the famous example of expository dialogue, or one of them, is the Council of Elrond. And, I mean, it's not bad, right? It's kind of a set piece of fantasy fiction, and it's just a whole bunch of people talking for a very long chapter. And I loved it, because I was like, finally, we get to figure out what the hell's going on. Give me some information. And I think that's a secret that sometimes gets lost. Everybody says show, don't tell, and don't have long expository passages. And that can be true, especially at the beginning of things where you're trying to hook a reader. But I think if you're writing a good story and the reader is excited and curious about your world, there comes a point where they're like, hit me with the chapter where we figure out where these damn elves came from, or like why those giant trees are there, or what, like, I just want to know. Like, for 200 pages, I've been curious about this, and you can just tell me now. I feel that way as a reader, and I think a lot of readers, if you earn it, will feel that way. One question I have for you guys, like sort of along these lines, is how comfortable are you letting your readers not fully understand things? You know, you introduce a term, a place, something. Do you feel the need to clarify that within that sentence, within that paragraph, or will you let them twist in the wind for, I mean, some writers, Hannu Rajaniemi, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, he's a Finnish sci-fi writer. He does not give a shit about you as a reader. He's like, here's some terms that I made up and places that I made up, and I'm going to explain nothing. And if you keep good notes, maybe by the end you'll understand. I don't quite feel that comfortable, but I'll let readers go for a while. Where are you all on that?
Wow, it's hard because as a reader, I kind of like being disoriented. I like not knowing things. I like being thrown into a strange world. So that is how I tend to write as well. I mean, like in this book, The Midnight Club, I invented a drug that shows people their memories, and it has a tiny bit of backstory and lore, but not a whole lot. Like there's no explanation of how this is even possible. It's just like, go with it. Suspend your disbelief, because the point here is the characters experiencing their memories. So that's kind of my tendency, and I like things that are a little bit mysterious and unsettling. But I've found more and more that editors and probably readers have issues with that, and they want things spelled out. They want to understand things. I don't know. Have you found that too?
As a reader, I'm very much the same. I mean, some of my favorite books lately, Rake's Fall and Saint of Bright Doors by Vajra Chandrasekhara. Just like utterly delightfully bewildered the whole time. Kelly Link short stories. Some of, we usually think of William Gibson as someone who explains things, but reading The Peripheral, it takes fully 2/3 of the book. It's like, oh, okay, now I have a sense of what's happening, and I had a great time for the first 2/3 of the book. But so I really love an enticing bewilderment that may or may not be satisfied by the end of the story. And I also love writing. That's actually one of the most frustrating things in terms of editor expectations, which I am also feeling a lot, especially in writing for kids, because I found that kids in general are really comfortable with not understanding what's going on. They're very accustomed to that feeling. Like, kids are not annoyed to find a new vocabulary word. And they're really, really good at navigating a circumstance that they don't expect to understand from a top-down level. Adults and adult readers have largely deluded themselves into that expectation that they can and should understand everything, and so feel a little more alienated when they come across. Yeah. So in general, I find young readers really comfortable with not understanding what's going on yet, and publishers increasingly less comfortable with giving young readers those books. So that's a little frustrating.
I mean, I think the editors, many of them, by temperament, are somewhat conservative. They're aiming, I mean, they'd all want to hit a home run and, be at the top of the Times list, but they want base hits, right? They want to get on base, and they have like almost a list in their head, it seems like sometimes, of like, oh, this is a little bit risky, don't do this, don't do this. And I think almost always those instincts are wrong. Not that you need to do everything on that list, but if you pull a book off of the shelf that is done really well, guaranteed it will be doing some stuff that would make an editor nervous, right? Don't you think that's the case? And certainly I think that's true in terms of world building as well. And just as you said, world building that can be delightfully disorienting. It's like going, I think, to a new city. You can either go there with a tour guide who's like, this is what this is when it was built, this is what this is, now we're going to go to the best restaurant, now we're going to go here, which is its own pleasure, but it's also delightful to just wander around and be like, what's down this alleyway? Oh, that's a weird statue of a crab god, I think. I think that's what that is, or maybe not. And you don't know. Maybe you never find out. I kind of love those moments in books where you're like, I think we saw a crab god. Maybe that's coming back later. Nope, never came back.
You've been asking us most of the questions, so I feel like we should lob more at you. Also, unlike the two of us, you've written many books in the same world. So can you talk about that for a bit, of expanding a world to that extent, volume by volume?
Yeah, it's great. You have a lot of chances to get things wrong, because you've done something in book 1 that by the time you're on book 4, which is years later, I've totally forgotten. And the copy editors are pretty good at that. And some of the books just got translated into Chinese, and the Chinese copy editors are incredible. They're like, back in your first book that, this person had a slightly different colored hair. And I'm like, I don't know, they dyed it. But I'm lucky enough to work in a really huge world that spans continents. And so when I get a little bit bored of a place, the plot takes me somewhere else. And so I'm almost always inventing new cities, religions, polities, stuff like that. And it was mentioned in the intro, but I used to teach history and world religion, and that's super handy because I draw on a lot of that real world stuff and kind of, give it my own spin. And so that helps me to think through when I'm, drafting up some whatever archipelago of trading states. Like, how's this going to work? Like, what would it actually look like? When we come down to brass tacks, and then I write 40 pages of history of that never goes in the book. But I need to do it, or like I said, the writing. It sort of feels like when you're on a movie set and you're like, there's nothing in these cabinets, right? Like if I look behind that door, there's nothing there. I hate writing that feels like that when I read it, and I hate it when I write that. And I'm like, I need to know what's behind the door, even if you don't.
It's very early Stanislavski. Of like, yeah, he made all his actors write essays and like what are the full contents of your character's medicine cabinet? And it's not in the script, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. Do you do drafts of your own maps? I mean, I assume you've got map makers doing the final ones, but.
Yeah, I love maps. I do in my spare time a sport called adventure racing that involves a lot of orienteering and getting very lost in the woods of New England and other places. And I like getting lost in my own maps as well. So like you were saying about Ursula Le Guin, I'll draw a map. And there's sort of promises to myself and to the reader that maybe not even in this book we're not going to go to that weird little bit of desert. But someday we're going to go to that bit of desert and we're going to figure out what's there. Maybe we're not in this jungle yet, but at some point we're going to find out who lives in that jungle and how things work down there. And that's exciting to me, like the blank spaces or blankish spaces on the map that when I open a big doorstopper fantasy, I want to see a map. If there's not a map, I'm like, what are we doing here?
Question from Margot. You write thrillers, which have their own rules about exposition, revealing information, giving tantalizing hints. Like maybe we'll go to that part of the desert. Maybe you'll find out what that shifty look between these two characters meant. Like the sort of breadcrumb dropping. How does that overlap work? Or what's fun about it?
Oh, it's tough. It's not easy. I mean, this book has dual narratives. This book has like present sections and flashbacks. So I have revelations that are slowly emerging through glimpses of the past in most of my books. I guess you could say the past is kind of like another world, another country in its own way, and we sort of lose touch with what actually happened there. But in the Library of Fates, I do have some magic. I think that might be my first book with actual magic in it. And because it's also sort of a thriller, it has to be revealed gradually. And there's a treasure hunt, which is like something that I had never written before, a literary treasure hunt. So there were a lot of moving parts. And I really don't have a magic system in this book. It's not like scientific Brandon Sanderson type magic. It's like, well, there was this witch in the 18th century and she had some magic and she made a magic book that can tell you the future. But she kind of messed up things at certain points, so it works this way and not that other way. Why? Because, well, magic's hard. You know, so I kind of I think because it's a thriller, you can sort of paper over, gloss over certain things like that. It's a thriller set in our world, so the magic system doesn't have to be entirely explained, and I feel like that's okay. I think some readers might disagree and might want everything spelled out, but it was sort of, because everything has to be kept in suspense, you don't want to have like a ton of exposition at the end.
Yeah, well, I have a question for you following up on that. Is that okay?
Yes, I just want to drop a resource for everybody. I've used it to teach many times. There's a blog post that N.K. Jemisin wrote many, many, many years ago, and the title is, But why does magic have to make sense? And it's an amazing rant about specifically the alt science Brandon Sanderson version of like a magic system, emphasis on the system, and then something a bit more numinous and less explained. And Nora sort of comes down on the numinous side. But then it's possibly the only thing on all of the internet where I encourage you to read the comments. Because the authors who weigh in on this in some really wonderful ways, it's great. So that's just a footnote resource for this part of the conversation.
Well, and that I have a question for you, but I'm going to follow up on that first, because it's a tension in the fantasy world in general. Do you have a magic system, or do you just have magic? And different people do different things. But I think it's important, even when you don't have a scientific system, Sanderson style, that people understand to some degree the rules of your magic. And I think this is a world-building question because it bears on character. If a character can wave their hands and disappear or escape from a dangerous situation or make their enemies go away, you sort of wonder, well, why aren't they doing that? And if you don't have an adequate understanding of magic or of other elements of world building, I think it is very hard to get a grasp on the characters that you're dealing with. Because you're like, well, why is she making that decision? It's not that I don't understand her, but I don't understand the world around her well enough to know, is this a smart decision? Is this a brave decision? Is this foolhardy? And I think sometimes people dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the character, and you're not going to get the answer there if the world surrounding the character is not in some way clear enough to the reader. It doesn't need to be spelled out in all of Sanderson's tedious detail, but it does need to be. It needs to be comprehensible. I think that's pretty crucial. But this is also maybe bats back to you because you've written both fantasy and science fiction now. What's the difference, sort of, in the world building approaches between those two things? Because I read, the sample on Kindle of your new sci-fi novel, and it seems to be, nominally anyway, set in our future, something that could be our future. versus something that's second world entirely. Is that
Yes.
right? Yeah. So how what was that like for you? Those two different approaches.
Kind of the same. Yeah, I mean, for me, like, absolute agreement with the sort of coherency and consistency. My process is a little less rigorous, unsurprising to anyone who knows me. It's largely intuitive, and so like, for example, Magic in Goblin Secrets. It's a book. So I was an actor, and this was my first book. And I tried to squeeze everything I knew about theater into a fantasy novel. So this is a secondary fantasy novel crossed with The Muppet Show. With magic that just works along very theatrical principles, all of which was intuited, all of which was based on my own experience as a recently ex-actor. Just, okay, how does this work? How do masks work? In a much fuzzier way than, I put on the mask of a fox and I turn into a fox. Like, it's not nearly that literal. So it's more associative and more intuitive, and just literalizing a little bit. Le Guin described a fantasy as metaphor made literal. And sometimes you really see it. Like, I don't know, Buffy, high school is hell. So what is the magic of theater made slightly more literal? And whatever felt consistent to me, based either on my own experience or on the chapters I had written so far, it's just like, okay, that's a left turn. Like, that you feel it. You sort of feel the dishonesty of it if you do something wildly inconsistent. And for me, that was very intuitive rather than rigorous. With science fiction, so much, it emerges so much out of setting and character. So for me, it's pretty much the same process. It's just the setting and tone is this science fictional future of our own world. And so I intuit a certain amount of consistency without trying to be too bound to it, in a sort of, like, some pretty bonkers things can happen in 1,000 years. So I honestly wrote it like it was a fantasy novel, without magic set in our future, if that makes any sense.
So there are AIs, obviously, they're a big feature of the book.
Yes.
But you didn't spend any time going down rabbit holes of current AI research or progress. You were like, I'm doing my thing, I don't need this.
Yeah. Oh, God. Okay. Short answer to that. One answer is I regret even using the acronym AI in the book. Martha Wells has started to use MI for machine intelligence, for just because the word, if it's a word even, means something different to us now, right now, than it has meant in decades and decades of science fiction. So that clash is awkward when they're such wildly different things. In science fiction, you're talking about actual people who are in some way synthetic. And when we say AI in our world, that's not what that means.
But you do address what AI means in our world. I feel like there's a particular passage that is very clearly referring to, like, current debates about AI writing. And I actually did that in this book too, which is about books. And there's something called the All Things book, which supposedly will give every reader the story they most want, and thus make all other books obsolete. And of course, I was thinking of AI, between the lines. So I don't know, like that. Writers are thinking about it,
Yeah.
But why did you decide to kind of put that subtext in there?
I felt like I had to. It's just I'm reading the articles while writing the book, and that part's fairly late in the book, and so like, okay, writing the oh, they're doing what now? Oh no. Okay, I guess I have to talk about this then, and it's sort of like it's partly a fantasy wish fulfillment, because what I decided is that in this distant future of ours, we actually outlawed AI writing immediately. Just like, no. And then this is 1,000 years later, and it's still illegal, but robots are people now and want to write poetry. And they're not allowed. So it's like wish fulfillment about the present, and then what are the possible complications of that in the future when, in my book, an AI is a person, which right now they are absolutely not.
So I want to open it up to the audience because I'm sure they will have questions. I also felt really bad for Brian because he doesn't have a copy of his book up here. So.
Yeah, it's like way bigger. And the font's tiny.
That belongs to Phoenix. You have to return it to them in a little while. Before we take questions, I just want to say we are in this beautiful space thanks to Phoenix Books, and they are our sponsor. They've founded the festival, and yeah. Okay, hands. Yes, sir. I'm going to actually hand this to you.
Hi. Quickly, Brian, what you were saying about showing versus telling makes me think of something someone once said, that nobody ever said, show me a story. They always say, it's tell me a story. And as for exposition and dialogue, well, if that's the case, then there goes the entire genre of detective fiction. But my question is, has anybody ever sent you an engaged email that of somebody who has more expertise on a minor point than you do and feels compelled to correct you?
Many times. I actually appreciate it. I like them. I got an email from a doctor one time. I had described I have sort of fantasy special forces characters in my books, and they were checking some stab wounds to try and figure out who had murdered some people. And I forget the detail, but the doctor said, I checked this on a cadaver yesterday, and I don't think you can reach whatever from wherever you were saying. And the people who care about horses have a lot of opinions about horses, to the point where I have learned not to include specifics. I'll tell you the horse is brown, and maybe it's large or it's small, but I include no other horse vocabulary, because somebody is going to have a strong feeling about horses. My understanding from other friends who write other genres is that gun people are also like this, and you just need to say, he pulled his gun, or you're going to get in a lot of trouble because you got something wrong. Yeah. Horses and guns. Yeah, you're screwed. I don't know. Do you get critical emails about things you got wrong?
Yeah, I don't really get emails from readers unless they're AIs who want to sell me marketing services, but I did have a fellow thriller writer who told me that she was like, oh yeah, you can actually lose a lot more blood than that without dying. So, because she researches everything painstakingly, and I was in a hurry writing a book with a full-time job, so I kind of didn't research enough. But I'm glad it was just one thing.
I usually get questions from kids writing book reports, but I did once get a lengthy, many-page letter breaking down numerous questions and showing a great deal of expertise for a book I didn't write. It was William Alexander wrote a book about French, and I got this linguist essay, and it was really fun to read, knowing that none of the mistakes were actually mine.
This question is probably mostly for Brian, but do you ever do world building just as a creative pursuit on its own, or is it always as a part of, a writing project that you're doing?
It's usually a part of a writing project, but like I said before, these books are so big, and the world is pretty vast. So sometimes it sneaks in the other way. Like I'll have an interest of something I want to explore. I want to read more about whatever, the founding of Buddhism or something, or the split between different branches of Buddhism. And then I'll find a way to start playing with some of those ideas in my book, because that can be happening somewhere. So often these explorations do play out somewhere in the books, but it's not always that, oh, for this book I need this. Sometimes it's like, for my own brain, I need to think about this some more. And so that's what's going to become part of this book. We're going to put some people on this area, and they're going to be thinking about this, because that's what I care about right now.
Ooh, I get a mic, that's fun. How do you do like fantasy, but it could be real? I think sometimes it's like this thing could not really exist with real constraints, and sometimes it's like, I'm gonna put real constraints on this to make it more fun. How does that work? And is this question coherent at all?
Let's see. So, yeah. I mean, right. So you have to ask yourself what the point of putting real constraints on the fantasy is. And I'm trying to think of an example here. Like, I think I always think of what the guy who, like the showrunner of Breaking Bad, he said something about coincidence, that if a coincidence is bad for your characters, then it's fine to use it. And if it's good for them, then you should avoid it because it seems too fake. And I feel like, I don't know, it's the same with merging fantasy and reality. Like, if a fantasy element makes things bad for the characters and makes a story and conflict happen, then it's good. Like, if it sort of clashes with the restraints of reality, it's good. If it's wish fulfillment, it's bad. Or, well, potentially bad, because you can have a combination of wish fulfillment and fantasy clashing with reality. I don't know. What do you...
Okay, I'm thinking about this in a couple of different ways for the mixing of fantastic and realist detail. And part of it is just giving ourselves permission, or just tossing a treat to the critical brain. I want to believe in dragons. I'm having trouble believing in dragons. How does the fire thing even work? Okay, here's a little hand-wavy, pseudo-plausible thing about, I don't know, they breathe flammable gases or something, and something to do with their digestive systems, and that's why, and how does it light on fire? I don't know. They just gnash their teeth in a way that's like banging rocks, and to get a spark to start a fire, and then boom, and then it's like tossing this little detail to my inner skeptic, who's like, I don't know, I'm old and jaded, and I can't quite believe in dragons anymore. It's like, okay, but what about this? And it's just like a distraction. You're not explaining dragons, but like you're tossing that part of your brain, just a bone, just like chew on this, dragons, and that, in a nuts and bolts creative writing crafty level, we're kind of doing that thing all the time, no matter what genre we're working in. John Gardner called them authenticating details. And it's just the little, you're not like describing everything about a thing, but it's the one or two details that make it seem real. I remember reading a story about kids around a campfire making s'mores. And there was just one line about how the graham cracker never breaks in the right place when you bite into it. And then, that chuckle, that moment of recognition makes that an authenticating detail. Like, before I was just like, yeah, s'mores, whatever. Now they're real. And once you have that detail, your brain will conjure the rest. The way the smoke from the campfire is following you, no matter where you sit. And just and how the s'more tastes. And I don't even have to describe any of that. And it's just that bite was authentic. And you're doing that with fantasy details as well. What is the authenticating detail of the impossible thing that makes it alive and gives yourself permission to believe in it?
Yeah, I want to just add one more thing on the end here, because I like what you said, that maybe you put in constraints because it makes it more fun. And I think that there's something really true to that. Robert Frost said writing free verse is like playing tennis with no net. And I don't necessarily agree with that. But the idea is that the games that we play, whether they're literary games or sports, are fun because there are limitations and rules. My son, who's sitting back there, made up a game when he was 4. It was not a very fun game. Because we sat down to play, and I was like, okay, what are my pieces? He's like, you have a leopard. And I was like, what can my leopard do? He's like, it can do anything. I was like, well, this isn't that interesting. And I was like, what do you have? And he was like, well, I have a dragon. And I was like, well, what does your dragon do? He's like, it can do anything. And we played for a while, but it wasn't a great game, right? Because any time I tried to do a move, well, I can do anything, and he can do anything. And I think that there's an element, like you said, you think dragons. Maybe in your opening chapters you establish some stuff about dragons, but then you have to play by the rules of the game you set yourself, right? I think that that's an important thing, and this plays into what you said, Margot. You can't suddenly in chapter 17 be like, there's a new rule, like my son was doing in the game, because then readers are going to be like, this is bullshit. I didn't know that rule. I've been engaged in this fantasy thinking I understood the rules, and I understood the rules that the characters were playing by. So you get to establish your own rules, and in fantasy they can be any rules, but then you got to play by them, and that's what's fun.
Hi, I've got the microphone. My question: my friend, when she does DMs for her D&D, she starts by peeling an orange because as the orange peel lays, that's her map. So I was wondering if there were any like quirks with world building that have served you that we could then steal.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I've never done that. Although I did used to be a DM as a kid. I'm trying to think, like when I really do world building. Well, I like to. Naming is one of my favorite things. I like to make up fantasy and weird names that are a little bit like, I know a lot of foreign names, foreign languages, and I like to make them slightly like that, but a little bit off. And I really don't like when I come across a fantasy character who's named like Jared or Kyle. I know Robin Hobb did it. I love her, but I don't need a Kyle. So like having baby name books around is one of my secrets for like when I do write fantasy type stuff.
Okay, I know so much more about things that writing steals from games than things that games can steal back from writing. And like we could talk for hours about that, and we're desperate for sometimes surprise, randomizing elements, whether they're dice or tarot cards, or there's a bunch of really fun surrealist games that are sort of Exquisite Corpse is probably the most famous, but ways of making a thing such that it surprises you, and which is what I love about the orange peel in particular, that it's that sort of, because when it's just us. Like, we can exercise control over everything or think that we should, and we shouldn't. And so that sort of throwing something at us that we can't control is such a fantastic way of restoring a sense of play to what could be several years of work in your basement with no one talking to you, and then you get a little weird. And I'd hoped by the time I got to this, I would have thought of something that could be stolen and used in a campaign. And I would say, I got it. But it's more character creation than world building. But the two are the same because it's like so backstory in this part of the world, and then that part of the world. My favorite surrealist part of the game is called Smoke. And I really love it for character creation in a way that snaps me out of what are their stats and what are the facts. It's a guessing game. Somebody thinks of someone, everyone else tries to guess who it is. But the information, rather than 20 questions, there are no facts. It's just, what kind of smoke are they? What kind of dinosaur are they? What kind of breakfast or shoe or anything? And it's amazing. And you're having fun playing this game, but it's impossible to guess. We don't have any actual information. And then suddenly it's obvious. It's like, oh, Hillary Clinton. Like, yes. But how did that even happen? Like, all we had was imagery. And so I really love in character creation in a role-playing game when something about creating the character is a little more associative and a little less, are they an orc? I mean, stats are really useful, but sometimes weird surrealist poet brain needs to get away from sort of player stats. And then playing okay, what kind of smoke are they? Can get, especially is your character a magic user, can then get at some of the weirdness of that in a way that can be really fun to play. Is that useful? Yeah. Cool.
I think we have time maybe for, were you going to add on to that, or?
Either way, if there's other questions, we can have another
do
question.
people
or
have?
I have thoughts.
Okay.
This question is for everyone. You were talking a little bit about the magic systems versus just free form magic. And to myself, that was kind of always a separation between a fantasy and a sci-fi, because there's fantasy that has a very strict rules and very good explanations for everything, and you can imagine that it's real, versus there's sci-fi sometime that has very kind of, well, things just work magically. Star Wars. Sure, yeah, exactly. So does it matter to you when you're writing a book whether you're sticking to a specific genre? Is it like fantasy all the way? It has to be fantasy, and then you maybe drop hints like you've said about the dragon, but you don't explain it in details and set up all of the kind of rules how it works? Or you're free to kind of roam between the genres, and sometimes you might explain everything, and sometimes you're just going to wave your hand and say, like, well, it just happens. Are you looking to make the world coherent that way and stick to one genre, or is it kind of free form?
I think you want your world to be coherent, but I think if you say to yourself, I'm writing in the fantasy genre, there are many, many ways to make a coherent world. My magic system tends to be a little bit more intricate, and there are a number of clearly stated rules in how it works, but there are some question marks. But one of my favorite moments of magic in any fantasy novel is in The Tombs of Atuan, the second Earthsea book, where Ged is under, he's down in the tombs, and the evil spirits are trying to crush them, and he's sweating, and he hasn't said much in a long time. And eventually he grunts like, I can't talk because I'm holding this whole place up. And you don't know how. You don't understand the mechanics of what he's doing. There's no incantations. There's no rules. But just the darkness and the weight and the pressure and the effort come through. And it's just a fucking awesome moment of fantasy. Like, he's holding this whole thing up. But other books aren't doing that. So I just think, again, you set your rules, and then you play by those rules. And your rules in fantasy can be more, as you said, science fiction, science-y, right? Those can be great books. They can be very, Tombs of Atuan, and those can be great books. But I don't know that it works super well to toggle between them. It would have been really disappointing if then we got an explanation in the next chapter of what Ged did to hold up the roof. I don't want that at that point, right?
Yeah, I feel like the distinction between science fiction and fantasy has gotten really confused, especially by the label speculative. Like, I thought this book was science fiction because it's the real world with one supernatural element that could theoretically be explained by science. But I was told that no, it's actually fantasy within the industry. So within fantasy, I've always, even secondary world fantasy, I've always kind of been attracted to stories like Le Guin's, where magic is it can be controlled in certain ways, but past a certain point, it becomes unknowable and very unpredictable and hard to control. Like I also read the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant when I was a teen, so that's another series where like what magic is just out of your control. So I tend to gravitate toward that. So there are some rules, like human beings have sort of figured out certain ways to control it, but they know that if they break the rules, or sometimes even if they don't break the rules, it's going to leave their control and become dangerous. But I also sort of write horror adjacent stuff. So, in horror fantasy, things tend to be unknowable.
Okay. So many science fiction writers the world over are going to be really mad at me. But in my head, it's all fantasy. Like all of it. I consider science fiction a subgenre of fantasy. And I know. I'll run to the car after this. It's things that are counterfactual to our present moment in some narratively significant way. That the past is another country, the future is another country, different rules apply. And I love all of these bonkers subgenres we've created. They're amazing. I mean, and trying to. I remember reading an anthology of steampunk stories that includes Kelly Lincoln, Gavin Grant edited it. Came out from probably Small Beer Press. One of the stories at the very back of the book is by M.T. Anderson, another guest at this festival, and it's set in ancient Rome. It's just anachronistic science fiction without any of the Victorian stuff that we usually associate with steampunk, because most of the stories were set in an alternate 1800s with robots or possibly magic, but definitely airships. And then he wrote, this ancient story with electricity, and his explanation for why that happened is that the founding myth of Icarus and Daedalus is that Daedalus died for being too cautious, and Icarus was the one who lived, and just having that as a founding myth of Greece and Rome meant that they dared more and invented more, and then they had a fully electrical Roman Empire, and I definitely had a point bringing that up, but just like messing with, you'll talk to someone who says steampunk is definitely Victorian England with science fiction and or fantasy included, and then to interpret steampunk instead as anachronistic historical science fiction was amazing, and reminds me that since Darwin, we've known that animal species are not that distinct from each other. Everything blends, and there's a universal common ancestor, and it's all fantasy. And my last point along those lines is that Brian Atteberry wrote a really fantastic book just called Fantasy. It's dense, it's academic, but one of the most amazing points of it is how well all fantastical storytelling can reconcile contradictions and paradoxes and worldviews in conflict. And just for example, everybody believes in luck and fate at the same time. We all do. Even when we know that everything is random, we also know that the tree meant to fall on my car because it hates my car. And that this definitely is destiny, even though we also know it's random. And a fantasy story is one of the best ways of reconciling the fact that all of us, all the time, believe in things that are mutually exclusive. And
I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for coming for this panel.